Thank you, MC. I'd like to, first of all, welcome you all to the series of, this first of the series of speakers debates. Thank you again. I'd like to welcome all of you to the a very warm welcome to each and every one of you that has been here to attend the first debates on the sustainable development goals and key development issues. I'm delighted to see so many of you that have joined us today. It's most encouraging to see. Thank you very much for your presence. Before we start the debate, I would like to take this opportunity to say a few words about the speakers debate concept. Those of you who know me well will know that I'm passionate about development issues. The adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs as they are commonly known, was an important step forward. The key question for us here in Fiji is how will we achieve the targets outlined in the SDGs? Too often discussions on development are full of jargon and language that makes it very remote from the people. Development should not be about targets or jargon. Development and SDGs should be about making the lives of people better. In a democracy, there should be open discussion and debate with different opinions and views about what we should be doing to make the lives of all Fijians better. The speakers' debate series will provide a platform for national discussion on these key development issues. The debates will bring together diverse opinions and will hopefully lead to rigorous discussion on these important issues. As you can see from the panel before you tonight, we have brought together voices from the government, from the opposition, the academia, the civil society, and from the international development agencies. The topic for today's debate was chosen some time ago, although the impact of Cyclone Winston makes it more relevant than ever. Climate change is covered in SDG 13 that commits all the countries of the world to take urgent action to tackle climate change and its impact. The damage caused by Cyclone Winston highlights just how vulnerable we in the Pacific are to climate-related disasters. I would like to take this opportunity to remember those who lost their lives and those who are suffering as a result of Cyclone Winston. Our hearts and prayers are with you. And amongst the suffering, it has been heartening to see just how we in Fiji have come together at such a difficult time. As part of my research for today's debate, I saw a quote from CARE International that said that Cyclone Winston is, and I quote, a horrible reminder of what will become an everyday reality if countries don't fulfill the promises they made at the Paris Climate Summit and keep global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This is indeed a sobering reality, and we will hear more during the debate about the impacts of climate change and whether the Paris Climate Change Agreement will make any difference to the lives of Fijians. Some of the main commitments to the Paris Climate Change Agreement are: 1, to keep increases in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius and to try to limit increases to only 1.5 degrees Celsius. 2, to limit the amount of greenhouse gases emitted by human activity. 3, to review each country's contribution to cutting emissions. And 4, for richer countries to help poorer countries by providing $100 billion of climate financing every year until 2025. The key question is, Was the agreement enough to tackle climate change? And will it be enough to ensure that Fiji does not continue to suffer the effects of climate change?
Is the Paris Agreement enough for Fiji and the Pacific Island countries? To that, I will say yes, the agreement is adequate, is enough, but it has now given us a major task for us, everybody in Fiji as well as in the Pacific Islands and our global community. The task is now upon us to ensure that the agreement that was reached in Paris is become effective and achieve the global target of reducing the global average temperature to 2 degrees, and all efforts should be made to ensure that we keep within the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit. Now that agreement was reached due to strong leadership from the Pacific Island leaders and participants who were in Paris. And together with that leadership, with the science that everybody contributed, as well as the policies that we developed, have all contributed to achieving that outcome. And I'm also pleased to say that from our institute, the University of the South Pacific, we contribute to that outcome through the participation of our country parties at the agreement in Paris. So we had 20 of our graduate students, both who have graduated from our climate change program, as well as ongoing students who were present at the negotiations in Paris. Now the agreement, as Madam Chair has pointed out earlier, has 3 key important issues. One, of course, is keeping within the 2 degrees limit, and for the Pacific, we achieved a very important outcome in raising the issue of the 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that has been included in the agreement. We couldn't have achieved the 1.5 degrees Celsius without the leadership demonstrated by the Pacific Island leaders. And that I would like to specifically mention Tony Libram, who led a coalition of our parties to ensure that this 1.5 degrees Celsius is included in the agreement. Now, for the first time since the UNFCCC conventions and all the agreements thereafter, that UNFCCC has called for a report, a special report on the 1.5 degrees Celsius. And they have called on the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to produce the report in 2018. Now that is a very important undertaking for us in the Pacific, including Fiji. We must ensure that Fiji and the Pacific Island countries are represented in the IPCC processes. The first meeting is taking place in April next month in Nairobi, Kenya, and we ought to ensure that Pacific is represented at that meeting of the IPCC. And therefore I'm calling on the leadership of Fiji as well as of the Pacific Island countries to ensure the Pacific's voice is heard during that meeting in Nairobi next month. This is very important because the 1.5 degrees Celsius report, its implications, and the future of the Pacific Island countries will be included in that particular report. Now, Article 4 of the Paris Agreement specifically call on countries, all parties, to ensure that they peak their emissions as soon as possible. And that includes both developed and developing countries. Although in the agreement there is some flexibility for developing countries to ensure that their commitments are within the resources that they have available to them. And that is important. It's now a job for us in Fiji, as well in the Pacific Islands, to ensure that the promises we made in our INDCs and the Paris Agreement are meaningful achievable, and also transparent to the global community. And at the same time, we must ensure that we meet those targets which we included in our INDCs. And it is good to note here that the Pacific and its leadership has been instrumental in ensuring that those commitments are reviewed every 5 years. And the first review will be coming soon in 2017. And we ensure we have the resources as well as the technical backstopping so that we can report to the review process that will take place soon. At the same time, we also need to look at ourselves, at the resources we have, and also to take account and take stock of our emission reductions. One of the areas which Fiji, including the Pacific, that need to work very hard on is reduction of the fossil fuel importation and use within the region. And one of the areas that need specific attention is in the transport sector, particularly in the maritime transport sector. And therefore we need Pacific leadership to ensure that we reduce our global fossil fuel combustion in this area of sustainable sea transport. And that is one area where we need the science in the region to support countries to ensure we keep within the limit of 1.5 degrees. And with that, thank you very much for your attention.
Let me at the outset thank the Honourable Speaker for organising this first debate on the topic. Was the Paris Climate Change Agreement a good deal for Fiji? No doubt climate change imposes the biggest threat to our human survival and that of planet Earth and its living ecosystems, both land and marine alike. What does the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment Report tells us about the future if nothing was done now? Global temperatures could be more than 4 degrees Celsius above what they were before the Industrial Revolution. Can Fiji's ecosystem, land, marine, terrestrial, sustain such a rise in temperature? It is very likely that the heat waves will occur more often and last longer, increasing the risk of health problems, particularly in vulnerable populations. Heavy rainfall events will become heavier and more frequent in many places, making flooding more likely. The oceans will continue to warm and acidify, negatively affecting marine wildlife and fisheries. Global average sea level will continue to rise, disrupting communities in low-lying areas and increasing the risk of coastal flooding from storm surges. Food security will be undermined as changes in the oceans affect fisheries and drought and rising temperatures reduce global crops yields. Was the Paris Agreement on climate change a good deal for Fiji? It is very important for Fiji to fulfill its obligations under the UNFCCC and in the new Paris Agreement in order for Fiji to realize its gains. The Convention and the new Paris Agreement contains rights and obligations to enjoy and fulfill. The Honourable Prime Minister will be in New York on 22nd April to sign and ratify the new agreement, a leadership commitment that government should be thankful, and it is important that Fiji continues to be on top of the game at all times. Government has made important commitments under its intended nationally determined contributions, and in the Green Growth Framework of the Honourable Prime Minister, for instance, government has committed 100% renewable source of energy by 2030, a bold move away from use of fossil fuels to power our economy. Such a move will positively benefit Fiji. Let me highlight a number of other important benefits to Fiji. Long-term temperature goal, Article 2. The Paris Agreement has resulted in a shift from fossil fuel-based economies, which have existed since the Industrial Revolution, to fossil-free economies in a matter of decades ahead. This is a big win for SIDS, SEEDS, and other developing countries. With a decision to peg long-term temperature goal to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels as given by seeds in the negotiations. It would significantly reduce the risks and impact of climate change, and moreover the risk of disappearing due to rising sea levels. Article 3, Finance. Fiji has already gained 30 million grant from the Green Climate Fund in 2015, the principal financing mechanism for climate change, as a first amongst seeds and developing country parties to fund the adaptation of the Suvarnasori water supply system through the Asian Development Bank as a accredited entity. There is more opportunity for Fiji to access GFC funds in the future to support our mitigation and adaptation commitments as contained in our intended nationally determined contribution and green growth framework. Adaptation, Article 7, adaptation initiatives and needs of developing country parties such as Fiji are recognized, and that should follow a country-driven, gender-responsive, participatory and fully transparent approach, guided by Green Growth Framework and National CC Policy, and Fiji being in the Board of Adaptation Committee. We shall continue to work hard in ensuring international cooperation and support, and our adaptation needs be enhanced. Technology development and transfer, Article 10, developing country parties such as Fiji will benefit from technology development and transfers from developed country parties under the agreement in order to improve resilience to climate change and reduce GHG emissions. The Paris Agreement, capacity building, Article 11. The Paris Agreement recognizes the importance of capacity building to LDCs and seeds in order to take effective actions to combat climate change adverse impacts and adapt. It should be country-driven, based on national needs, and moreover foster country ownership. The support of developed country parties to enhance CB actions in developing countries parties, such as Fiji, is a must. Now I'll give a global perspective to the climate change. I shall call it the Earth Wars. The countries that generated the COP21 Climate Change Summit in Paris agree that global warming caused by greenhouse gas emissions is a serious threat. However, when it comes to agreeing on 5 issues, there is blood on the floor. One is finance. The battle is developed countries want developed nations to provide adequate green funds to help them mitigate and to adapt the consequences of climate change. In Paris, they want the West to shell out far more on the polluters pay in principle. Developed countries claim to have set aside 100 billion annually for this. Then adaptation. The ask is adaptation, getting poorer countries to cope with fallout of the climate change. The battle is developed countries are refusing to make firm commitments and promise an announcement by the end of the Paris Agreement. Developed countries are skeptical. The ask in mitigation, the developed countries insist that developing countries should also take up ambitious commitment and are trying to dilute the principle of common but differential responsibilities enshrined in the 1992 Climate Change Convention. The game is on the isolated island. And in technology, if I can ask Madam Speaker, I only give me 1 minute. Thank you, Madam Speaker. You have the battle in technology, and as well as capacity building and loss and compensation. Those are the issues on the global scale. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The question that has been put is very simply, was the Paris Climate Change Agreement a good deal for Fiji? To my mind, the answer is an emphatic yes. It definitely was. That does not mean that it solves all of our problems, but it certainly was a good deal. And to my mind, why? The question why, the answer basically for 3 reasons. 3 reasons that I believe why this agreement is very good. First, because this agreement is addressing one of the most important crises that's impacting us on the world today, which is climate change. It's affecting the ability of us to live on a planet that will allow us to sustain life itself. from the perspective of somebody responsible for health in this country, I believe that climate change is the biggest public health issue we have right now in the world. Because it's not something that's going to happen to us 10 years from today or 15 years from today. It's impacting health today. As we speak right now, it's impacting on us today. So we needed to have a lot of attention placed on this internationally so we can come together and agree on some actions that can be taken to address this greatest public health concern that we have that exists right today. While I was in Paris late last year, in the meeting in Paris, I heard the Secretary General of the World Health Organization speak on the impact of climate change on health. And I'd just like to quote some of the things that she talked about. She estimated that climate change is already causing tens of thousands of deaths every year. Already. Not next year, not 10 years from today, already doing this. She talked about the fact that climate change degrades air quality, it reduces food security, and it compromises water supplies and sanitation. And the consequences of all of these things are deadly. Deadly, they lead to death. Experts predict, once again from the WHO, that by 2030, climate change will be causing an additional 250,000 deaths every year from malaria, diarrheal disease, heat stress, and undernutrition alone. Let's not talk about all of the other things that will cause. The heaviest burden will fall on children, women, and the poor, widening already unacceptable gaps in health outcomes. So for me, anything that can impact on the world, that can address this public health issue, is something that's good for Fiji. So if this agreement can lead to cleaner air, more abundant and safer water supply, better food security, better social protection for our people, it will lead to a healthy population, and that is always going to be good for Fiji. That's the number one reason. Number two reason, because this time we have got an agreement that is better than what we had before. Before we had Kyoto, there was no sort of an international agreement on Kyoto. But now we have got agreements and endorsements from the powers of this world, the largest countries in the world that they have the potential, the power to make an impact on the world. They haven't agreed to this agreement. That is something that is beneficial to all of us. The Suva Leaders Declaration, the Honorable Kilarak has already talked about, it enunciated or outlined the kind of things that our small island developing states wanted to take to Paris. We talked about, we wanted to keep the temperature to below 1.5 degrees. We talked about the Paris climate change to be legally binding. We wanted to have mitigations reviewed every 5 years. We wanted loss and damage to be anchored as a standalone element that is distinct from adaptation. We wanted adaptation funds to be 100% grant financed. The good thing to note is that a lot of these things are to be found in the final agreement. A lot of the things we wanted were there. Maybe we didn't get everything that we want, but we managed to get them. So I say congratulations to everybody that came from the Pacific, to our Prime Minister that was there, the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, and everybody that was involved in making sure that the things that we wanted got into that particular agreement. The third reason that I believe that the Paris Agreement has been good for Fiji is because of the long-term benefits that it brings. The Honorable Kilarak has also outlined this, so I'll just very briefly restate some of the things. It's talking about a long-term temperature goal. We had fought very hard for 1.5, but we got 2 degrees, with a strong emphasis on 1.5. If we're able to do that, we'll be going a long way to saving the lives of the people in the Pacific. Long-term temperature goal to well below 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 above pre-industrial levels. Just to get an international agreement where everybody's focused on that is already something that's of benefit to Fiji and to our small island nations. The second thing, long-term benefit that is coming, is the emphasis on loss and damage. A lot of the small island states have focused on loss and damage because there's going to be a lot of impact on us. Supported by G77 and China, Fiji and the other small island developing states who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, we have gained recognition in our world efforts in securing loss and damage in the agreement, guaranteeing the need for averting, minimizing, and addressing losses due to climate change. Because these things are going to happen. We need support in helping our countries to be able to deal with their impacts. Having that recognized in the international agreement gives us a base upon which to source funds, to source technical expertise that can allow us to have an impact on these things in our country. Thirdly, has been talked about the finance, the 100 billion US that was discussed in Copenhagen, and has once again been stressed in this agreement. Fiji has already been mentioned, has already got $30 million for the water supply, and we are now looking at other ways of sourcing funds. For Fiji and also regionally, there's been some discussions on that. Since the president has been taken by the Honorable Kilray, I'm sure that Madam Speaker will give me more time. I think there was a lot of discussion in Paris about differentiation that has been touched on. The developing countries should help. There should be a distinction between the ability of countries to be able to deal with the impact of this of climate change. And in this context, we notice that Fiji will benefit from founding opportunities provided by large developing economies such as China under the South-South Cooperation, which is now pledging US 3.1 billion. That is, again, something that is of benefit to Fiji. Through this agreement, we have access to this funding that allows us to put into place projects that can assist our people. In the Paris Agreement, it ought to acknowledge now that climate change is a common concern for humankind, and therefore parties should, when taking actions to address climate change, respect and promote and consider the respective obligations on human rights, the right to health, very important, the right of indigenous people, local communities, migrants, children, persons with disabilities, and the right to development, as well as gender equality, empowerment of women, and intergenerational equality. That is very important for us, and I'm glad to say that the Fiji delegation fought very hard for that paragraph to be included in Paris. There are initiatives on adaptation that are there that will be important for us. Our access now to benefit from technology, development and transfers from developed countries. The agreement opens up that for us, and also for capacity building, to develop our own people here in Fiji so that we can deal with these issues. At the end of the day, Madam Chair, I believe that the Paris Agreement definitely provides a basis upon which we can build further. It will be our duty in Fiji, especially the government agencies, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to fully participate in all of the other forums that will take place internationally to make sure that we ultimately get the best, maximum benefits for our people, to make sure we can survive for the generations before us.
This is a very timely question, of course. Was the Paris Change Agreement a good deal for Fiji? I think before I would talk about that specific question, I would like to acknowledge and commend the government of Fiji for being the first country to decide to adopt the Paris Agreement within their parliamentary system and then bringing that forward in April to the Secretary General and the signature at that point. And also for Fiji's leadership in the UNFCCC process, specifically with their ambassador for climate change and oceans. So was the Climate Change Agreement a good deal for Fiji? I give it a mostly yes. So it's a bit qualified with mostly. It does provide a clear vision. That's important. There is a clear vision, there's a clear signal of what the world needs to do. They set that signal in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty. So this is not a standalone issue, it's a development issue integrated into development work. But there are some weaknesses, and as such, this agreement itself will not solve the climate change issue, but it will be a good step forward. I just want to go back to this talk about the Industrial Revolution quickly, a little bit of my science side. The world has been pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere unsustainably for more than 150, almost 200 years. At the time of the 1850s, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was about 280 parts per million. So that's the concentration in the atmosphere. It had not been that high, 280 parts per million, in 800,000 years. And since then, and the measurements now show it at 400 parts per million. So just in the last 150 years or so, we've increased the background concentration of carbon dioxide from 280 to 400 parts per million. And we know there are the impacts that we're feeling as a result. As a result, in the 1980s and 1990s, the world got together and through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change on the scientific side, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change on the political side, decided to do something about this. Now, that UNFCCC process and the IPCC process is going on for a while. The cynics would probably say that maybe the Paris Agreement isn't much different. However, there is a significant difference here. We have a commitment to hold that temperature to well below 2 degrees in efforts to limit that to 1.5. And to note, since the Industrial Revolution, we've already gone up 1 degrees. So we're already almost there. And to make that commitment in an agreement, I think, is a bold step for the governments of the world. And I think that was a very good way forward. This is a negotiated text of 195 parties. So there's going to be some good and there's going to be some bad for Fiji, I would say. So one of the questions, in addition to was it good or not, was could it have been better or worse? Well, could it have been better? Absolutely. Could it have been worse? Most definitely. Just to take one example, on the mitigation side of things, is that countries in the lead up to Paris made pledges called the intended nationally determined contributions, or INDCs. When you take these bottom-up pledges, you aggregate them together and do some science calculations in there, you get about a 2.7 degrees increase. So we've already done one. The INDCs showed 2.7, but the convention is saying stay well below 2. The strength of the agreement is that there is a mechanism in place to ratchet up and strengthen the INDCs, which are now going to be called NDCs. They dropped the I, no longer intended. And so there's a mechanism in the Paris Agreement that can ratchet up emission. And there's an idea of no more backsliding. So whatever is being put on the floor now is the minimum, and countries need to increase emission over time. I think this is one of the biggest, most powerful aspects of the agreement. I was there in Paris working with a team on climate finance and the leadership of a focal point from Palau and some colleagues here from Fiji and around the Pacific. And I'll just make a couple points on finance and if that was a good deal from the Fijian perspective. Article 9 is the finance article. There are, it answers the question of finance pretty clearly. It says developed country parties shall provide financial resources to assist developing country parties, and then it goes on about for what. Now this probably isn't all that very different than what was under the convention in 1995 when it came into effect. But there's a second paragraph to that one, and it starts off with the term, these two words, other parties. This is actually quite significant and a big difference from the original convention in 1995. And so what it says is other parties are encouraged to provide or continue to provide such support voluntarily. Much like the Honorable Minister mentioned about the $3.1 billion from China, it opens up windows such as those to countries. On the $100 billion goal, one thing about this is that we really haven't defined what climate finance is yet. So that's a debate, and that's a debate that Fiji needs to enter into. There is an OECD CPII report that talked about reaching this $100 billion goal. In that report, it says currently they're reaching about $62 billion a year. But that's been argued by some countries, saying that it's only the money going through the convention that counts towards this. And the difference between the $62 billion and the $2 billion that's going through the convention is quite large. My final thoughts. Collective action will be important for the Pacific. No one country can really go this alone. They have, Madam Speaker, I'll finish up with my last point. This working collectively will be extremely important. And right now, Fiji is poised to capitalize on this. And as the Honorable Speaker mentioned, all the ingredients are there. The question is how to make this happen, but for who is to make the lives of the people of Fiji and throughout the Pacific better. So I leave with that. Thank you.
The question we are discussing tonight is very interesting, and one for which there is no simple answer. Is the Paris Agreement a good deal for Fiji? Well, yes and no. Yes, because it heralds the end of the fossil fuel industry and shows a recognition by all leaders of the severity of the problem that is climate change. And no, because the commitments within the agreement are voluntary, and currently the intended nationally determined contributions that have been submitted are leading us towards at least a 2.7 degree rise in global temperature. This is nowhere near the 2 degree goal that has been set out, let alone the 1.5 the Pacific Islands advocated so strongly for. All countries, especially the major emitters, will need to take a strong and concentrated action to ensure that the disastrous impacts of human-induced climate change are minimized as much as possible in the very near future. On that note, I would like to acknowledge the great step the Fiji Parliament took last month to agree to ratify the Paris Agreement, becoming the first country to do so. We at PCAN support the move, and we hope more Pacific nations will also follow suit. We need 55 countries to ratify, as well as countries that account for at least 55% of global emissions, for the agreement to come into effect. We hope to keep the momentum and leadership of the Pacific going throughout the year and assist Fiji in being the model for all other nations. The fact that we were hit by Cyclone Winston merely days after this decision was made shows how critical the situation is. The Pacific has been affected by 2 Category 5 cyclones within a year, where previously we had none. Scientific studies, such as those carried out by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, show that extreme weather events will intensify further, and we've seen the damage that can be caused. This is just one of the many terrifying results of global warming and climate change. The Paris Agreement can help in finding solutions to reverse these impacts, but it is not a miracle document that is going to immediately save our planet. It is a positive outcome and one that we can build on. The Paris Agreement will become the first universally legally binding agreement on climate change that is accepted by all the 193 member states of the United Nations. Once ratified, it will apply to both developed and developing countries alike. From the Pacific point of view, the Paris Agreement was positive because it managed to capture all the basic positions we were advocating for in the Suva Declaration on Climate Change. As has been mentioned, the Paris Agreement includes reference of the need to limit global average temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, the 5-year review cycle of the mitigation targets proposed by developed countries, continued financing, provisions to address loss and damage as a separate element from adaptation, and reducing emissions through REDD+. Rapid action to address climate change is a matter of survival for Pacific people, and as such, the Pacific region always puts forward the most ambitious proposals on the table at negotiations. It was through the Pacific team's brilliant leadership that we saw the inclusion of many of the positions we took to Paris. The dynamics of partnership between Pacific civil society groups such as PCAN with Pacific governments and development agencies such as the Pacific Islands Development Forum built the capacity of the Pacific to stand up to the powerful nations in solidarity and unity with one another. As a young person studying diplomacy and attending a COP meeting for the first time, it was an enlightening and informative experience for me. I was lucky enough to be part of the Fiji delegation and followed closely the loss and damage negotiations. For Fiji and the Pacific, the loss and damage outcome was good in that it was set out as a separate article, and a provision was included to allow the Warsaw Mechanism on loss and damage to grow and strengthen. But it could have been a lot worse. One of the major red lines for both sides was an exclusion of liability and compensation clause within the agreement. Developed countries, led by the US, proposed this provision, which would forever remove the rights of countries to sue others for loss and damage incurred through human-induced climate change. This was strongly opposed by the Association of Small Island States, AOSIS, and the G77 plus China. As a compromise, the French presidency included a mention of this clause specifically related to Article 8, loss and damage, in the decisions document rather than in the agreement itself. In conclusion, Paris was never meant to be the last step. It was meant to be a progressive step in identifying new common grounds to address climate change together collectively through a new universal agreement. With this in mind, the Paris Agreement is a good deal for Fiji, though incomplete. The Pacific will continue to be climate leaders post-COP21 and keep going strong to survive climate impacts and show leadership to the world. Through this leadership, our governments can influence and encourage others not only to achieve their INDCs, but constantly strengthen their emissions reduction targets. This will give us a better chance of keeping global temperature rise within 2 degrees, maybe even restricting it to 1.5. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, has said, "There is no plan B, because there is no planet B." Therefore, we must show great strength and commitment if we are to help save Tuvalu, the Marshall Islands, Kiribati, and indeed several low-lying islands and coastal areas in Fiji that are among those on the front lines of climate change. And if we can save these places, then surely we can save the world. Thank you.
Mahendra Kumar from the Pacific Island Development Forum. Thank you, Speaker and panelists, for your very enlightening presentations. I just want to make 2 comments, 2 points I want to raise. One is probably a comment, and the other one is a question. My comment is in relation to what I think most panelists have concluded, that by and large, the Paris Agreement is not a panacea, but it's really the beginning, it's the building block for a possible solution to the climate change issue. And actually, the test of the Paris Agreement would be the ability of Fiji and most countries to implement the Paris Agreement. And in order to do that, of course, what we need to do, and that has been alluded to, I think, by Honorable Somate, that make sure that we are there and make sure we get the mechanics right. You know, how the nuts and bolts, how the processes, how the procedures for implementing the various parts of the agreements are actually drafted. And to do that, I think our negotiators need to be extremely diligent, and they need to be part of all these meetings to make sure that we get the process right, so that we are able to get the required result. And the second question, I guess somewhat provocative one, is following on from what Honorable Kenny Williame, I think, had said in relation to these long-held values of polluter pay principle and common but differentiated responsibilities of parties. Now, some would say that in Paris Agreement, we, the developing countries, have compromised this long-held, cherished idea of polluters pay and an agreement based on some sort of common but differentiated responsibilities. In other words, we have let the big industrialized rich countries off the hook. What I would like to perhaps the panelists to comment on is if they really believe that the agreement is fair, ambitious enough, and is based on the principle of equity. Thank you.
I guess, looking at, you have fair, ambitious, and based on equity. When I was watching the president of the COP, how he did his business, I felt like I was sitting like at the foot of a guru of foreign diplomacy. What I watched and witnessed was someone who he listened to all the voices in the room until they were exhausted. And he did that with engagement, and not just by going through a process. He listened actively, all the way till 5, 6, 7 a.m. in the morning and sometimes. And so when I witnessed his procedure, and they called it the Indaba method, from the time in South Africa. When I witnessed that, I was kind of wondering, how we would come to any conclusions. So that was then, and you were there, so you know this as well, and others, is that in conjunction with the public statements, then he also had a team working on the sticky issues, such as loss and damage, and others. So in terms of a process, in terms of the process, I think that, I have my limited international agreement adoptions under my belt, one. But watching that process, you could see the inclusiveness associated with it, the voices heard, and the genuine interest in getting parties to make an agreement. 195 parties. I could get 195 individuals in a room and never come to agreement, let alone 195 governments of the world. So I think that he did that, but then you'll notice, and one thing that I also took from it was on the very last moment before the agreement was adopted, which actually he forgot to hit the gavel right away. He actually went, oh wait, I have to do this to make it adopted at 7:27 on 12th of December. He listened to everybody. And then at the last moment, he says, does everyone agree? You do? Okay, done. He didn't ask a question at that point of anyone, as if they finally agree on that final one. In the sense of, we've all talked about it, we have it, and now we're moving forward. And so watching that and the way it was reported and the way the process happened, it was inclusive. So on that fairness side of the process, I think that's there. On the issue of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities, I think this will remain an open issue, specifically, because in that you have different ways of seeing what respective capabilities are. You have different ways of accounting for it. Historically, since 1990, and other baselines. So that will be a debate that will probably never be settled, and certainly not in this discussion today, but those are just some of my personal reflections from the process. Thanks.
Would you like to add to it?
Yes, I kind of rushed because of my limitation in time. I simply mentioned a common but differentiated responsibility enshrined in the 1992 Climate Change Convention. This is the third issue, is in regards to mitigation. The ask is global temperatures should not rise by more than 2 degrees Celsius this century. To do that, under the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, developed countries had to commit to legally binding cuts in their carbon emissions, with the US and other developed nations refusing to rectify the protocol. The effort has been a dismal failure. So the battle, therefore, is for the 196 member nations to pledge voluntary reductions called intended nationally determined contributions, or INDCs. But when added up, this would result in a 3.5 degrees Celsius rise in global temperature, which is way beyond the tipping point. So the developing countries like India says developed countries must vacate more carbon space, as developing countries have millions of poor who are deprived of energy. But the developed countries insist that developing countries should also take up more ambitious commitments and are trying to dilute the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities enshrined in the 1992 Climate Change Convention. This game is not to isolate areas like India or countries like India, but calling it obstructionist. So that is the addition to the comment that I made. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahendra, for raising that very provocative question. I think the issue of common but differentiated responsibility is not entirely lost in the agreement. If you look at Article 4, Section 1, there is still some allowance for that particular issue to be factored into the agreement. If I may read Section 1 of the Article 4, it says that in order to achieve the long-term temperature goal set out in Article 2, Parties aim to reach global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible, recognizing that peaking will take longer for developing country parties, and to undertake rapid reduction thereafter in accordance with the best available science, so as to achieve balance between anthropogenic emissions by sources and removal by sinks of greenhouse gases in the second half of the century on the basis of equity and in the context of sustainable development and efforts to eradicate poverty. So that means that they still allow for developing countries to ensure that they don't compromise their development aspirations to support their populations at the expense of reduction in terms of emissions of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas emissions.
Hello everyone, thank you very much. I'm Matisse from Greenpeace. Thank you, Dr. Kumar, for your question. Just a quick question. Firstly, a comment. I noticed a lot of the speakers spoke about Fiji's commitment and making sure that we also drop our greenhouse gas emissions ourselves. And I just wanted to point out that across the Pacific in total, despite covering a quarter of the Earth, we are only responsible in the Pacific for 0.03% of the emissions in the world. So we're not doing too badly as is. I also just wanted to ask the question as to our sort of plan forward, and if there's space within Fiji's diplomacy methods when dealing with our international partners, such as Australia, to ask for their roadmaps as to how they're planning on actually implementing the Paris Agreement and dropping carbon emission to zero by 2050, since it seems that their words say that they will, and then a week after Paris they approve a coal mine near the Great Barrier Reef. Is there space for Fiji to take a leadership role in that and actually ask that, as opposed to just helping us constantly rebuild, we can see proof that they have a plan in place to drop their carbon emissions and to stop investing in the fossil fuel industry? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I'm from Ministry of Health. But I think when we were going up to the lead up into all the discussions that were taking place on climate change, Prime Minister was also always referring to the coalition of the selfish. That there needed to be, from those that were the greatest emitters of greenhouse gases, to take a moral view on this issue. And I think, on one hand, I'm very grateful that we've been able to get the Paris Agreement, because it's a development from where we were in the past. But at the same time, as pointed out, the voice of the Pacific, we need to have a combined voice, not just Fiji, all of the other small island nations, to continuously come together and address those kinds of issues. I think together as a group of the most vulnerable countries in the world, if we can continue to voice our concerns on those things and getting all these countries to ratchet up their commitments, as a voice we can have an impact in terms of the numbers that we have. But I think I'll just leave it at that.
Yesterday was International Women's Day, and I'm very glad to hear Minister for Health reiterate the intergenerational connections, but also the gender connections. And so as the UN Commission on the Status of Women meets in the coming 2 weeks with a focus on the Sustainable Development Goals, we now have a new CEDAW general recommendation focusing on rural women and the rights of rural women, and we have 50% of our population still underrepresented, particularly in local decision making. Those commitments from Paris to gender equality, to intergenerational, how do we make it relevant on the ground in the communities? How do we work through not just the political barriers, but the structural barriers that we still face in our societies, so that women and young people are really part of that implementation?
Is I mean, this is where the rubber hits the road, right? I mean, these agreements are quite lofty. I think that I'll start with just maybe one example. When I was working in Samoa, and we had a small village there of about 200 people, and the village was having water issues. And so when we went there, you know, that was disproportionately affecting certain parts of the community, the elderly, the disabled, the women's role in terms of water usage as well. And so what we did is we worked with the community to identify a fairly low-cost method to get water piped to houses. So this would be an access to water issue that would then support, I said, different parts of the community, youth, elderly, including women. I guess my point of all this is that it's about the specific project design. When you're working at this project level, when you're designing the projects, it needs to be done in an inclusive manner. At this point, the finance that we have coming for climate change, we've seen a tremendous increase in the amounts of finance. And the question is that finance going through a gender lens? Is it going through looking at disabled? Is it looking at the youth? Is it looking at the elderly? So it's the social and environmental safeguards that become so critical. And that's when we look at some of the vertical funds under the UNFCCC, such as the Green Climate Fund. They've stressed these aspects. So I think that we have the enabling environment there, and it really comes down to individuals and the people who are acting, and who are those actors, and who are the principals, and have the responsibility for implementing this climate change work. I think the other thing that I've always noticed about climate change finance is because it is growing, that it's able to have knock-on effects for other development work. And so when you're looking at engaging with communities, there's governance systems there, and those governance systems are then influencing how you're going to implement. And so you actually have to look through the governance systems through this risk lens, climate lens, and then when you're implementing, how that affects all populations. And that we actually look at the results of this. So it comes down to individuals and a systematic means within national policy in any country that gives the mandate to make this happen, because we have it at the international level, and then we just have to have it at the national level as well to complement that, such that it will enable officers and people working at that level to be able to do this type of work. So that's a somewhat of a response.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think when I made my first statement today, mentioning that the agreement is there now, but it has now given us more work to do more, so that it has now become everybody's business to ensure that we all contribute to the reductions in the emissions that we all agreed to in the Paris Agreement. And that means everybody now working together, taking on that responsibility at all levels, from the national level, from government to local level, and right down to communities. Putting in place systems and establishing or strengthening structures that will accommodate and allow for equal participation of everybody to contribute to achieving an implementation of the agreement. When Fiji talked about in the INDC, saying that they are committed to reduction of 40% reduction in emission by 2030, then it's across the board. It's everybody who are involved or who will be affected, or in one way or another, who will be impacted through that commitment, will be involved in the whole process. And that will include government, civil society, the private sector, the industry, as well as the markets, because everybody will contribute to ensuring that there is reduction of 40% emissions by 2030.
Sitting here, listening to honourable ladies and gentlemen, I can't stop thinking of some very important speeches made by some important people on this planet. Perhaps they have some relations to this phenomenon of climate change. Firstly, I remember Albert Einstein once said, our world is faced with a catastrophe of or a very huge catastrophe, so to speak, that it seems to have outstripped those who have the important decisions for good or ill within their power. The unleashed might of the earth storm has changed everything except our thinking. And mankind needs to change our thinking if it wants to survive. This was Einstein. Now, some people might think that this is irrelevant to the topic under discussion, but I think it's worth mentioning the quotations the speakers made by some very important people on this planet. Let's look at Max Planck. Max Planck once said about science and religion, science and religion are not opposed to one another. It must be regarded, Well, simply he said, the one does not exclude the other. They are complementary and mutually interacting. Man-made science is a tool of perception in his religion as the guide of action. I'm also reminded of a Chinese saying, which, to quote, mystics understand the roots of the Tao, but not its branches. Scientists understand its branches, but not its roots. Mysticism does not need science. Science does not need mysticism, but man needs both. Mysticism is necessary to understand the deepest nature of things, and science is essential for modern living. What we need, therefore, is not a synthesis, but a dynamic interplay between mystical intuition and scientific analysis. This problem of climate change, I think, needs a proper scientific analysis by the scientists of the world. And before that, just let me quote Henry Kissinger in 1974, speaking in the United Nations in New York, and also to the House Senate in the United States of America. Kissinger said that this world is on the razor's edge, and Western civilization is heading towards ruin unless we acknowledge our mutual dependency. And also, at the same speech, he mentioned of the birth pangs of a new order. The old order is crumbling down, and the new one is still difficult for us to imagine. It's coming up. It's rising up. I think it is now time for mankind to look at this phenomenon, problem of climate change, very analytically, scientifically, and analytically. Perhaps it is now time for the scientists of the world, for the universities of the world, to make your students understand fully the relationship or to understand the biosphere, really. The life, what gives life to the organisms of this planet, the biosphere. Perhaps a change in the curriculum in the schools is necessary. And it's not only that. Perhaps, tell me if I'm speaking too much.
I think your points are very clear, and actually Mr. Kevin Petrie is able to respond to the issues that you have just mentioned. Thank you very much.
We need.
Thank you. I will just respond.
I'll probably talk to the professor sometime. Don't worry about it. And talking about jumping about because I can't just try to talk about what I have in mind here.
Would you like to respond?
I'll make two quick points on this. One is that the current Pope Francis has last year released the Laudato Si, which was the Catholic Church's response to the issue of climate change. And it provides an extremely robust framework within the Catholic Church on responding to climate change. And I think it provides a good moral compass in terms of the issue of climate change. So I think this Laudato Si is a very important document amongst other religions in the world who've already presented their response to climate change. That's one. But I think we don't need to look too far for some of this wisdom. You mentioned a lot of very intelligent people, Einstein and Max Planck, etc. But I'd like to bring it a little bit closer to home. And at one point I had an audience with His Highness from Samoa, Tuiatua, the head of state. And in that he expounded to me on the four harmonies associated with the indigenous concept of peace in Samoa. And I'll just briefly say it, that it starts with yourself as the first circle, then peace with others, and then peace with your environment, and peace with the cosmos. So it actually brings together the human side, the social side, the science side, the philosophical side, and the spiritual side. And I'm betting if we look closely here in Fiji, we have some models that would be able to be used as well. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all the speakers for their very interesting presentation from various perspectives. One thing that was highlighted by several of the speakers was one of the greatest achievements of the Paris COP was that the voice of the small island developing states, Fiji included, was strongly heard, and that contrasts quite strongly with previous conferences, in particular the previous landmark conference in Copenhagen, where the small islands were really struggling to be heard. What I would like to ask the panel members is how was this achieved, and what are the structures or processes in place to strengthen this collaboration between all the small island developing states, so that in the next negotiation the voice is again heard and even louder. Thank you.
At this COP, for the first time, we had a collaboration of the PSIDs, the Pacific Small Island Developing States, which are 12 Pacific states. And this COP, for the first time, they were meeting every other day to discuss a common voice and common positions that they could then take to AOSIS and G77. So I think that was a major reason why we were able, our voice was heard so strongly this time around. And also because we knew that it was at Paris that we would have to take a stand. This was one of the last times where we could really make a difference and get a legally binding agreement for the future, for after Kyoto ends in 2020. So I think that was important.
Just one addition to that, I also believe that the AOSIS really got media behind them, and there was a very strong pressure in terms of the asks of the AOSIS, and that was, I think, a really important asset for the group.
Ken Lacansian with the Citizens Constitutional Forum. Skeptics would say that climate change is inevitable. I guess my question is mostly on the finance side of financial mechanisms. The question is, What are the financial mechanisms that are needed for addressing the impacts of climate change, say for example, Winston, and the relocation, assuming that we don't go below the 2-degree agreement that we've been talking about?
If I got you right, what is needed? Part of what's going to happen in terms of what's come out of the Paris Agreement is to identify needs as well. So there's going to be a process where countries are going to be able to articulate their needs. That's been done in various forms, through national policy, through national education programs of action, and a variety of other means by saying, what is needed. I think it's a very tricky issue in terms of, if you said if it goes beyond 2 degrees, is that what you were saying? Is if it goes beyond 2 degrees, then what's going to cost then?
Assuming it doesn't go below.
Yeah. So if it doesn't, there are calculations on this globally in terms of costs of adaptation, as it were. And so this is the argument about the balance between adaptation and mitigation. And so early on in the convention, there was mostly focused in the early years about mitigation issues and trying to reduce and basically stop the problem from its source. Don't emit or sequester more carbon into biomass. But basically, the emissions haven't reduced very much, and therefore adaptation has become extremely important response, especially here in the Pacific. And so there's a recognition in the agreement, and I can't point to the exact para right now, but there's actually a paragraph that says that the amount of adaptation funds needed will be related to how much mitigation can ultimately be done, because obviously if the mitigation isn't achieved at a certain level, there's going to need more adaptation. But of course, that's not, the cost benefit on that is not in the favor of trying to adapt to climate change to the existing, because you have loss and damage issues, which is things that are irreparable or damaged permanently, such as cultural losses, sea level rise, maybe sovereignty losses, etc. So I think right now the balance has swung back to say adaptation is an important aspect and that finance needs to go there. And now that if it goes above 2 degrees, we all know that the costs of adaptation increase dramatically. So I hope that answers your question.
I was just thinking that talking about that adaptation, it's not, to my mind, it's not waiting for the 2 degrees, because it's already happening now. And I know I'm not an expert on climate change and all the health mechanisms and all the financing mechanism, but I know already in the Ministry of Health, we have identified the impact that climate change will have, for instance, on our health facilities, the ones that are being inundated by water, the impact of climate change on diseases and how they're spreading on water and sanitation. So already there can be some estimates of these things. And these sorts of studies are being funded, going towards trying to identify places in which we can access resources, internationally or regionally, so that we can try to address these issues. There's also some discussion in health together with UNFPA on sourcing some of these climate funds in terms of how it's impacted on young women and children and all the things that are related to that. So we don't have to wait for 2 degrees. It's here right now, and our challenge is to try to identify the problems that are arising, specify them, and see where we can access those financing sources.
I'm just hearing about climate change. As a young person, I'm really concerned about what climate change has really affected our lives in Fiji. Not only our lives as human beings, but also our food sources and some other stuff. So my question is, what are some highlights? Can you just highlight some of the strategies being put in place for the government relates to the agreement of climate change?
Can you just repeat your question?
What can you just highlight us on some strategies being put in place by the government of the state to implement on the agreement being put in place?
How government is trying, what action government is taking to implement action on the climate change?
Yes.
Okay. I think I can talk more on my health perspective. Because I think if I look across government as a whole, I will not be able to give you that full perspective. But in terms of health, as I pointed out, we've identified, for instance, that there are climate-sensitive diseases. There are certain diseases, as your climate begins to change, as your rainfall patterns change, as your temperature patterns change, these diseases come to the fore. So that what we need then to do is to put in place the preventive actions that try to allow us to mitigate against these diseases. Those are some of the things that are happening in the health sector. In other areas, for instance, I've been going around to places like Koro Island. If you go to Koro now, it's completely devastated. You can look through the green forest and you can look straight through. There are no leaves on Koro. Now, if that is an impact of some of these Category 5 cyclones, is a result of climate change, then obviously all of the actions that we're taking to allow us to adapt, because we cannot stop these cyclones from coming, they'll be coming. The government is now looking at these plans of how it will address these things when they happen again. So we're looking at things like resilient crops. We're looking at things on how we can help people survive in this kind of environment. In places like Koro now, the school children are leaving the island, they're coming to Suva. So there's not only going to be health issues, there's also going to be social issues that arise. As people live where they're living, children are coming, families are broken up. So in all of these areas, there are already programs that are in place across a whole range of different ministries. But as a result of this, there'll probably be a lot of reflection, a lot of asking about what went wrong, a lot of fine-tuning of the plans and the programs that we have to try to mitigate against this and its impact in the future. Those are just some of the things that immediately come to my mind. But I think we're going to learn a lot from what has just happened over the past 3 weeks or so. It's going to help us to fine-tune our plans for the future.
Just from an outside point of view, the climate change policy for Fiji is a very robust policy looking through each of the sectors. I think it's very clear about the direction that Fiji is trying to go. So I think if I were you, like looking at the overall response, I would look at the climate change policy. And also noting that the National Development Strategy is being finalized now, I think that's a really important entry point to ensure climate change is mainstream throughout the development, and that could be a real important entry point for Fiji.
Thank you very much. To our right honourable friends, I've always wanted to say that, right honourable friends. Just to twist the question around a bit. My name is Murtaza Juwanji from UNDP. What happens if the agreement is too good a deal? Is there any risk that this may take away the important role we've already heard in the room today, the important role of government ministries, of partners, of communities, private sector already active in countries like Fiji? Where I'm coming from with this is even if we're able to achieve the 1.5 degree target, even if we're able to mobilize substantive amount of funding, is that going to provide a disincentive for stakeholders active on the ground to do less to address these issues? Thank you. I'm interested in the panel's perspective on that.
No. The scale of the problem is so astronomical, the scale of the problem. I don't even think we really understand how big the problem is in terms of the sea level rise, in terms of ocean acidification, in terms of the loss of the coral reefs, the loss of biodiversity, the loss of culture. Like the level at which we're talking of potential loss here is tremendous and sometimes unquantifiable. You're an economist, so I know you want numbers, but this is intangible, some of it. And so you say it's a disincentive, but see, I turn it around the other way. I see this as the opportunity that the development world should really hold on to. Because here are funds coming to communities to help address basic issues. And if that can be enshrined into local development plans and ways of doing development, we have a tremendous opportunity. And so there could be in some cases disincentives created maybe in isolated spots, but I would say overall this is the opportunity of our generation, especially when you look at SDGs and where we're going with that. This is something that needs to be mainstream throughout.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for coming back there. I just wanted to respond to a couple of points. The point which one of our earlier speakers made about why SIPs or the Pacific prevail, the small islands prevail this time. I think we should not, we should forget the leadership role the small island states played in this particular conference. I mean, if you look at the investment of the Pacific countries in terms of the number of leaders, Fiji had about half a dozen ministers. In fact, all the countries had heads of state, and many were engaged right to the bitter end. I mean, you all heard Prime Minister of Tuvalu, for example, John Kerry, rang him until the very, very last minute to make sure that he was comfortable with the loss and damage of statement. We had Minister Tony de Bloom, the President Kiribati. So I think in terms of investment, Pacific really did very well, and I think we should really salute our leadership, our political leadership. And with that, I think we should really challenge ourselves as technocrats to make sure that we live up to what the leaders' expectations are in terms of implementing the agreement, making sure that the nuts and bolts actually are there to deliver a good result. The second point I want to make in relation to the opportunities, and I think Mutaz's question and Kevin's response, really, I think it is quite timely, because the Paris Agreement provides, I think, a new opportunity for full participation by all stakeholders. I mean, I believe so far in many climate agreements, the role of the business sector, the role of civil society have only been given lip service. The Paris Agreement actually strengthens the participation. And the message is very clear. This issue needs to be dealt with through the participation of everyone, including the private sector, the civil society, and they all need to be together in order to tackle this problem. And while I'm looking at opportunities, I just want to mention as well these nationally determined contributions which people have talked about. I think that's another opportunity for the Pacific, for Fiji, everyone to actually develop credible climate action plans. You can call it whatever. But I think if you look around, countries have climate policies. If you look at the INDCs, in fact, many of them have been brushed up because there was a requirement and everybody was to be seen to have submitted this INDC before they went to Paris. But they need a lot of strengthening. Fortunately, the Paris Agreement allows for this provision, particularly for SIDS and developing countries, to strengthen the INDCs. And I would say that this is a tremendous opportunity for all of us to look at the sort of issues which Honorable Sumate was talking about, how to respond in the various sectors, to have a whole of government integrated approach to the issue of climate change. Because as has been mentioned, it's a development issue. It's not just the role of the climate change division or foreign affairs or planning. It is really everybody's responsibility. And really the test would be if our national determined contributions can be used to develop a proper climate action plan which everybody is comfortable with and which actually aims to try and deal with the issue. Thank you.
Madam Chair, Senator Tegawuni, one of the students at the University of South Pacific. I hope I'll be talking on behalf of them. A few observations and maybe last question to my friend Kevin. It's reassuring for all the speakers to highlight the bottom line of after the Paris of 21, what is there for Fiji in enhancing or establishing catalysts to provide positive transformational impacts to the lives of our people. And Kevin has highlighted the one-word answer to the question on the whiteboard, mostly yes. The observation, and I hope our honourable members of parliament here will probably hopefully take this as an opportunity, because the next question that can come next after that question on the whiteboard is, what are the current capacities of Fiji right now to maximize climate financing so that it can trickle right down to the people, especially poor, Honorable Minister of Climate. Now, when we talk about capacities, it usually goes on three levels: the systemic level, the organization, institutional level, and to the individual level. Individual here, I want to highlight the glorious opportunity for academia to play in this role. And I also have noticed a few community leaders here. And this is where Fiji really needs central government to have this analysis of whether our current system, our current connectivity of institution and organization are really, or can deliver, or can maximize climate financing. Either we look at it from multilateral funding level. Kevin has talked about DCF, and we have GEF. And I also noticed our dear friends here on ODAs, on bilateral levels. This is where the connectivity needs to come in. So my question is rather, at the MP's level, and I thank Honorable Kuliraki because he is a member of the Subcommittee on Parliament and Natural Resources. And this is something really critical for Fiji to do right now, is to assess whether the government structures, institutions and systems are conducive to maximize this climate financing to come through to Fiji. That's probably a question to Kevin and also maybe to Dr. Morgan. What is your frank views on the system that we have right now? Is it really receptive to receive and maximize climate financing for Fiji now?
Yeah, I mean, this is a question I grapple with every day and do support Pacific Island countries in this type of work. Ultimately, it needs to benefit the communities. And so the question is how to maximize that and make it most efficient and effective. Fiji has taken a very strong step forward in doing some analysis in this area, and it's still in the approval process by government, but there's this climate public expenditure and institutional review that is being looked at in terms of these institutional and individual capacities, and make suggestions according to sort of the holistic systemic point of view in terms of responding to climate change. Once you have the correct policies in place, then you need the institutional structures to enable those policies to be delivered. But I would note that even without that review, it was a very interesting move then from an outside observation in 2012 with or 2011 the movement to foreign affairs of the climate change division. And one of the things that I had heard about that was it was about accessing more finance so that the missions could actively work towards getting and attracting finance here in Fiji. And maybe that's exactly why Fiji was the first in the GCF to, and I'm just speculating, but the external looking way which Fiji looked for the finance over those years, and the Ambassador Yavoli with his key role in the UNFCCC, and with all these really key things, they positioned themselves institutionally, I think, to potentially access. And now it's the opportunity exists with it being in finance, because now we're talking about climate finance, and so finance is that central type of ministry. So I think just looking at it from an outside point of view, it seems that you've been able to effectively look at institutional capacities over the years, and then I think it comes down to individual capacities. And on one last note, that right after the $100 billion pledge made in 2009, there was a study done to say how many more people, just physical bodies, will it take in some of the very big organizations globally that are doing climate finance, like DFID, USAID, and others, how many more bodies will it take per extra $1 billion processed through their systems? And it was about, I think it was like 25 or between 25 and 45 extra bodies just to do the processing of this type of level of finance. And so I think it's important that countries scale that type of down to the country level and see, you know, how many extra people need to be trained, and this like links to USP and their role in terms of getting people trained up, and Genevieve and people like her coming up and being able to, you know, be part of the strategic thinking, but also this important implementation.
Yeah, just to add on what Kevin has mentioned with regard to having systems and structures in place. I think for Fiji, you already seen that there are already existing structures and systems, but as always, there are no structures and systems that are always perfect, and therefore there's always room for improvement, strengthening, as well as adjustment to the changing time and space in terms of climate change and climate change financing. And there's always room for capacity building in the areas of institution, organization, and individual to ensure that the systems and the structures that we have in place are operational and meets the needs of the population of the country. And that means getting those systems and structures in place so that they accommodate the priorities of everybody. And that means coming down right down to the communities, as well as at the local level, provincial level, and up to national level, so that all the development priorities of everybody are accommodated in those systems and structures, so that they reflect national priorities that can be then placed for government support through any financing opportunities that are out there. Thank you.